April 17, 1945. The burning flag, the black smoke curled into the gray April sky, twisting above the ruins of our barracks like a final omen. The flag, that cursed emblem I once saluted, burned from its pole, crackling as the red turned to black. I was on my knees, my hands raised, my SS insignia glinting faintly in the firelight. The roar of American tanks echoed down the valley, closer with each second, and the cries of women and children filled the air like a broken hymn. That was the day I realized that the Reich, the mighty empire I had pledged my soul to defend, was nothing but a machine of death, and I had been one of its gears, cold and blind. Around me, the remnants of my unit had thrown their rifles aside. Some wept, others simply stared at the ground, hollow and motionless. The field was littered with the wreckage of our pride, helmets, torn banners, the shattered remains of men who once believed they were invincible. I could smell the Oland blood mixing in the mud, and I remember thinking how small it all seemed now. The ideals, the loyalty, the endless speeches, all swallowed by the smoke rising above a lost cause. The ground trembled beneath the advancing Shermans. Every explosion drew closer, every shout in English cut through the air like thunder. One of my men whispered a prayer, another begged me to give an order, but I had no orders left to give. The war was over for us, though no one dared say it aloud. The last command I could offer was silence. When the first American truck appeared through the haze, I forced myself to stand. My knees shook, my chest ached with every breath. I raised both arms high, my pistol already discarded somewhere in the dirt. For a brief moment, I thought they might see me as just another surrendering officer, a man stripped of power, harmless and beaten. But even in that act of surrender, I felt the weight of my past pressing against me like chains. I wasn't just an enemy soldier, I was a symbol of what they had come to destroy. The Americans approached cautiously, rifles aimed, fingers tight on the triggers. Their faces were covered in dust and rage, not the wild fury of battle, but the colder kind that grows after too many friends have died. One of them, tall and young, stopped a few meters away, his eyes fixed on the insignia still pinned to my collar. I saw something flicker there, grief, hatred, and recognition. Behind him, another soldier muttered something I couldn't understand. The next sound was a single gunshot, sharp, close, final. The man beside me, a corporal from Munich, fell instantly, a hole through his chest. I didn't move, I didn't breathe, my mind screamed, but my body stayed frozen. The smell of gunpowder mixed with the smoke of the burning flag. In that instant, I understood. The war didn't end with surrender, it didn't end with treaties or parades. It ended when the soul of a man faced the ruin he had helped create, and realized that forgiveness was not his to claim. The flag collapsed into ash behind me, carried away by the wind. I lowered my arms slowly and waited for the next shot, but none came. Only the silence remained, a silence so heavy it felt alive. And there, on that ruined field, I stopped being an officer. I was no longer a believer, no longer a servant of any cause. I was just a man, one who had finally seen what the fire was truly burning away. April 18, 1945. The echoes of Dachau. That night, as the Americans herded us into what remained of a barn, sleep refused to come. I lay on the cold ground, staring at the beams above me, while the memories I had buried for years came back with merciless clarity. Dachau, the name itself felt like a cursed whisper in the dark. I had been there, not as a prisoner, but as one of the men who kept the gates shut. I remembered the smell first. It was impossible to forget, a sickly mixture of ash, disease, and despair. The chimneys smoked day and night, a constant reminder of what we had done in the name of duty. We told ourselves it was necessary, that we were purifying, cleansing, building something new for the fatherland. But now, lying in that barn with my hands bound, I saw their faces again. The hollow eyes, the trembling hands, the silent acceptance of people who knew they had been abandoned by the world. During those years, I convinced myself I was not like the others. I didn't strike the prisoners, I didn't pull the trigger. I was just following orders, processing papers, signing forms. But those papers condemned men and women all the same. Each signature of mine had erased a life. I used to think that obedience was strength, that to hesitate was weakness. Now, in the ashes of defeat, Obedience felt like the greatest sin of all. Outside, I could hear the distant rumble of artillery. The front was still alive somewhere beyond the horizon. The Americans spoke quietly among themselves. Their words carried through the gaps in the wooden walls. They were laughing, perhaps trying to remind themselves that the war was almost over. Their laughter felt human. Mine, long ago, had not. I closed my eyes and saw the gates again, the words Arbeit macht frei gleaming under a gray sky. How many times had I walked beneath those words, believing in them? The prisoners never looked up at the sign. They knew the truth better than we did. We, the so-called elite, believed we were serving destiny, but all we served was cruelty disguised as order. When I first heard of the camps being liberated, I felt anger, not guilt. I told myself the Allies were spreading lies to poison our morale. But now, with our banner burned and our empire gone, I could no longer hide behind lies. The echoes of Dachau lived inside me, not as sounds, but as silence. The silence of those who die unseen, unheard, unremembered. One of the Americans opened the barn door at dawn. He ordered us out, one by one, checking our uniforms, taking our names. When it was my turn, he paused, staring at the insignia still faintly visible on my sleeve. He said nothing, but his eyes said everything. I felt my stomach twist with shame. For the first time, I wanted to tear the uniform from my body, to bury it in the dirt. But I knew it would change nothing. The mark was already carved deeper, in my memory, in my conscience. As we marched toward a makeshift holding camp, I caught sight of a nearby field dotted with white crosses, fresh graves, American and German alike. The wine carried the faint scent of spring, of life returning to the land we had destroyed. Yet for me, that air was heavier than ever. The echoes of Dachau followed me with every step. And I knew they would never fade, not even after the war forgot our names. April 19, 1945. The orders no one questioned. By the time dawn broke over the valley, the war had already left its mark on everything. The land, the sky, and the faces of those still breathing. We were lined up outside the barn, our shadows long and thin in the pale morning light. I could hear the Americans shouting commands, moving us like cattle toward another truck. I obeyed without hesitation. It was instinct, the same instinct that had guided me through years of service, through the nose of propaganda and the silence of guilt. Obedience, it had been the foundation of everything we were taught. Orders were not to be questioned, orders were truth. In the SS, we learned early that to think was to doubt, and to doubt was treason. For the fatherland, we repeated until the words lost meaning. It was easier that way, easier to be a tool than a man. I remember the briefings in Berlin, the crisp uniforms, the smell of polished boots and tobacco. Our commanders spoke of purity, strength, destiny. We nodded, wrote reports, and saluted. We didn't see the faces behind the statistics, only numbers, quotas, and directives. I signed orders for transfers, for special handling, for shipments that had no return list. I told myself it wasn't my place to ask questions. I was an officer, I had a duty. But every document was a silent crime, every seal a confession waiting to be read. As we were loaded into the truck, I stared at my hands, the same hands that had signed those reports. They trembled slightly now, caked with mud and soot. The Americans guarded us with rifles across their chests, their expressions cold but controlled. I envied their discipline, not the kind born from fear, but from conviction. They fought for something they still believed in. We had fought for a lie too monstrous to name. The road was littered with the debris of a dying empire. Burned vehicles, scattered helmets, bodies left unburied. Civilians walked past the wreckage with hollow eyes, pushing carts filled with what little they had left. I saw a boy no older than 15 wearing a Hitler Youth armband, limping beside his mother. He looked at me with hatred, not the hatred of an enemy, but of someone betrayed. I lowered my gaze. As the truck jolted forward, my mind drifted back to the training grounds. I could still hear the instructors' voices. Weakness is treason. Mercy is decay. The right does not forget hesitation. We believed it. We wanted to believe it. It gave us purpose when the world around us demanded blind faith. Yet, sitting in the back of that truck as a prisoner, I realized how cowardly our obedience truly was. We had mistaken fear for loyalty. The American convoy stopped near a crossroads, where a column of smoke rose from what had once been a village. The sergeant shouted for us to get down. As we stepped onto the dirt road, I recognized the smell again. Burned wood, oil, flesh. Another place consumed by orders, another scar on the map. One of the soldiers, a young man with a scar on his jaw, looked at me and muttered something under his breath. I didn't need to understand the words, I knew their meaning. We had done this, to them, to ourselves, to the world. I once thought that strength meant following without hesitation. Now I knew that true courage would have been to say no, but no one had dared. No one had wanted to. The sergeant signaled us to keep moving. As I walked, I wondered how many others among us were haunted by the same thought, how many still clung to the illusion that we had been right. The sun climbed higher, burning away the morning mist, revealing more of the destruction we had left behind. We had obeyed until there was nothing left to obey. And now, standing in the ruins, I finally understood. The greatest crime of all was how easy obedience had made it to destroy everything human inside us. April 20th, 1945. The silence before the shot. We reached the edge of a destroyed village by midday. The convoy halted near a field scarred with craters, where the remnants of a farmhouse still smoldered. The Americans ordered us out of the truck, forming a line along the road. The silence that followed was heavy, the kind that presses on the chest until breathing becomes an effort. I raised my hands again, as I had done the day before, palms open to the cold wind. Around me, a dozen SS officers did the same. No one spoke. The American soldiers moved with caution, rifles steady, eyes sharp. They had seen too much death to trust surrender easily. I saw it in their faces, exhaustion, suspicion, and a pain deeper than fury. They weren't there to gloat. They were there to finish what they had started. One of them, his helmet tilted low over his brow, stared directly at me. There was something different in his eyes. Not hatred, but recognition, a kind of personal reckoning. He stepped forward, his rifle pointed toward us. Another man followed, whispering something in his ear. I couldn't hear their words, but I saw the change in the first soldier's face. His jaw tightened, his hands trembled slightly before he steadied them again. I later learned that his brother had died in Bastogne. That knowledge came too late to matter. Without warning, a shot cracked through the air. Sharp, immediate, final. The man to my right collapsed into the mud, blood blooming from his chest. I didn't move, none of us did. The body twitched once, then went still. The silence returned, more deafening than before. The Americans stood frozen, their leader barking something I couldn't understand. The soldier who had fired lowered his rifle slowly, his eyes fixed on the ground. I remember thinking, he's not killing a soldier, he's killing a ghost. We were all ghosts by then, walking remnants of a cause that had devoured itself. The man who fell beside me had once laughed during briefings, proud and eager. Now he lay face down in the dirt, indistinguishable from the hundreds who had fallen before him. The sergeant in command ordered us back into formation. His voice was steady but low, as if even he feared what might come next. I stared at the lifeless body, and something inside me cracked. Until that moment, I had thought surrender meant survival. But in that field, with the wind carrying the echo of a single gunshot, I understood. No one leaves a war untouched. Not the victors, not the defeated. The Americans gathered the fallen man's weapon and moved us toward a nearby ditch. My boot sank into the mud where he had fallen, staining the trousers of my uniform. I could feel my heart pounding, but not from fear, from the sick realization that this was justice, raw and imperfect. The world was balancing itself in blood. When they finally signaled us to stop, the soldier who had fired walked past me. For a brief instant, our eyes met. He looked younger up close, his face hardened by grief. I wanted to speak, to say something, not in defense, not in apology, but as one human being to another. But there were no words strong enough to bridge the gulf between us. He turned away, rejoined his unit, and the silence returned once more. The sky was clouded, the air still thick with the smell of smoke and earth. Somewhere in the distance, artillery thundered like an afterthought of the dying war. That was the moment I stopped believing in victory or defeat. The front lines no longer mattered, the uniforms no longer meant anything. All that was left were men broken by choices, some by what they had done, others by what they could never undo. The silence before the shot had been heavier than the sound itself. Because in that silence, the truth lived. The truth that none of us, not even those who pulled the trigger, would ever escape the weight of what we had become. April 21, 1945. The makeshift camp. The Americans marched us north through a shallow valley where the grass had just begun to grow again after the winter. It might have been beautiful once, before the war had stained everything gray. Now, the only color that remained was the dull brown of dried mud and rusted metal. We moved in silence, the only sound the clinking of our boots and the low hum of engines escorting us from behind. Every few steps, I could hear a man stumble, too weak or too dazed to keep up. No one reached out to help. Mercy had long vanished from both sides. When we arrived, I saw the camp, a rough enclosure of barbed wire, surrounded by guards and machine guns. It wasn't like the camps I had known. There were no barracks, no shouting, no dogs. Only a bleak orderliness that felt alien to me. The Americans had turned an open field into a prison overnight. The earth was uneven, still torn by shell fire, and the smell of smoke drifted down from a burned farmhouse nearby. They handed us canteens of water, a loaf of bread for every few men, and then they said nothing more. It was the silence that struck me most, not anger, not hatred. Silence. The guards watched us as though they were studying something they could never understand. Their eyes were calm, but distant, the kind of look soldiers, or when they've seen too much. They didn't spit, didn't curse, they simply stood there, rifles in hand, while we lowered ourselves to the ground and waited. For the first time since I joined the SS, I felt what it meant to be truly small. The insignia on my collar, the rank I had once been proud to bear, meant nothing now. I was no longer an officer, no longer feared, no longer powerful. I was just another uniform sitting in the dirt, stripped of everything but the weight of my conscience. I remember one American soldier, young, with tired eyes and a face that looked barely older than a woe's. He handed me a tin cup of water without a word. Our hands brushed briefly, and he flinched, as though touching me burned him. I didn't blame him. To him, I was the enemy, a man who had stood on the wrong side of every human line. Still, he didn't turn away until I nodded in thanks. As dusk fell, the camp filled with a quiet rustle, men shifting, whispering, coughing. Some prayed, others stared blankly at the horizon, as if waiting for it to swallow them. The air grew colder, and the cries of distant artillery faded into the night. I sat against a wooden post and tried to imagine what would come next. A trial, execution, or worse, living long enough to remember it all. Around me, the men began to argue in low voices. Some cursed the Americans, others the Reich itself. A few still clung to the fantasy that our Führer would strike back, that Germany would rise again. I no longer had the strength to believe in anything. The empire had fallen, and with it, every illusion I had built to shield myself from what I'd done. When the guards walked their rounds, I caught one of them watching us closely. His expression wasn't cruel, it was wary. He wasn't looking at soldiers anymore. He was looking at men broken by their own making. And in that gaze, I found something I hadn't expected. Justice. Not vengeance, not forgiveness, just the cold, quiet balance of consequence. That night, as I lay on the damp ground with nothing but my coat for warmth, I stared at the stars above the barbed wire. They looked distant, indifferent, untouched by everything we had done down here. For the first time, I felt shame, not fear, not pride, but a deep, unrelenting shame for deserving exactly where I was. And as the wind moved through the wire, I realized that silence can be its own kind of punishment, because in it, you finally hear everything you've tried so hard to forget. April 22, 1945. The doctor. Morning came gray and bitter. A thin mist clung to the camp, wrapping the barbed wire in ghostly outlines. We were ordered to sit in rows as the Americans moved through, checking the wounded among us. One of my men, Schreiber, a boy barely 20, had taken shrapnel in his leg during the retreat. The wound had gone bad, the flesh swollen and red, the smell of infection rising with the damp air. I thought they would let him die there. It would have been easier. Then an American medic appeared. He was young, maybe the same age as Schreiber, his uniform stained with mud but his movements calm and steady. Without hesitation, he knelt beside my man. He didn't ask who he was or what insignia he wore. He simply opened his kit and began to work, washing the wound, cutting away the ruined cloth, binding it with clean gauze. Schreiber flinched and gasped in pain, and the medic murmured something soft in English, a tone that needed no translation. I watched in silence, disbelief growing in me like a fever. This was not what I expected from the enemy. We had been told the Americans were savages, ruthless in victory. Yet here was one of them, tending to the leg of a soldier who, days before, would have shot him without a second thought. When the medic finished, he stood and turned toward me. Our eyes met. I forced myself to speak, the words rough in my throat. "Why?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. He looked at me for a long moment before answering, his tone quiet but clear. "Because he's human," that was all, for simple words. But they struck harder than any bullet I had heard in battle. Because he's human. Not because he deserved it, not because of pity or duty, but because humanity was reason enough. He moved on to the next man, leaving me there with the words echoing in my mind. For years, I had been trained to forget that truth. We were told compassion was weakness, that mercy polluted discipline. We learned to see people as numbers, obstacles, or threats. The Reich had taught us to strip the humanity from others, and, without realizing it, from ourselves. I looked at Schreiber, his face pale but peaceful, and I felt something inside me crack. Not guilt, that had already taken root, but something heavier, recognition. This American had done more with a single act of kindness than all our speeches of glory and tyranny combined. As the day wore on, the camp settled into an easy quiet. The wounded rested, the guards paced, and the rest of us stared at the ground, lost in thoughts we dared not share. Every so often, I caught sight of the medic working, his hands steady even as the sky darkened and rain began to fall. He never looked at us with hatred, only with the weary eyes of a man trying to hold on to something good in a world gone rotten. That night, I couldn't sleep. The rain tapped against the tin cup beside me, and the medic's words kept circling in my mind. Because he's human. It was such a simple thing. So simple that it had taken a world at war for me to finally understand it. The Reich had promised greatness, destiny, 1,000 years of glory. But in the end, it was the enemy who reminded me of the one truth we had buried beneath our flags and slogans: humanity. That was the victory we had never earned. April 23, 1945. The torn documents. The rain did not stop through the night. By morning, the ground had turned to a thick soup of mud that swallowed our boots with every step. The camp smelled of wet fabric and exhaustion. A few men whispered of escape, others of suicide. I said nothing. My war was already over, and what remained of me was only the weight of memory. That evening, as the guards withdrew to their posts and darkness fell, I took out what was left of my service papers, identification, commendations, and the insignia that once marked me as SS. They were soaked, the ink fading. In the glow of a small fire we had built from broken crates, I held the papers above the flames. For a moment, I hesitated. That insignia had once been my pride, the symbol of everything I thought I believed in. The pride had burned with the Reich itself, the paper curled and blackened. My name disappeared first, then the eagle, then the lightning bolts. Around me, a few men watched in silence. One after another, others began doing the same, feeding their pasts to the fire. It wasn't redemption, it was survival. The flames flickered against our faces, and for the first time in years, I saw my comrades as men, not soldiers. Defeated, stripped of illusions, waiting for something that might never come. As the fire died, the smell of char and smoke clung to my clothes. I thought of all the names those papers represented, the lives ended by the signatures we had written, the orders we had obeyed without thought. The fire had consumed the documents easily, but not the weight behind them. When I closed my eyes, I still saw the symbol glowing red in the embers, as if refusing to die. The sound of the wind through the wire carried whispers that no one spoke aloud. We had built our own prison long before the Americans did. That night, I slept beside the ashes of my own name. April 24, 1945. The voices of the village. The next morning, we were marched toward a nearby village. What was left of it? Smoke still rose from collapsed rooftops, and the air carried the scent of burned grain and dust. The Americans wanted to move us closer to supply lines, but to me, it felt like walking through the corpse of a nation. Civilians watched as we passed. Their eyes followed us with a hatred I could not deny them. Some shouted, others spat. I kept my gaze down, afraid to see the faces that might remember mine. And then I did see one, a woman standing by a well, her clothes torn, her face streaked with soot. She looked at me for a long time, then spat in the dirt at my feet. I knew her. Her husband had been executed the previous winter for aiding deserters. I had signed the order myself. The reason was meaningless, an example, a warning. Now, her eyes held the full weight of that decision. I wanted to speak, to apologize, but my throat closed. What words could exist between executioner and widow? The Americans kept us moving, but her face stayed with me. Each step felt heavier than the last. The village itself was silent, save for the distant sound of hammering as survivors tried to repair what could not be repaired. Children peeked from behind broken walls, their faces thin and pale. To them, we were the monsters from stories, and they were right. When we reached the outskirts, I looked back once. The woman was still there, her gaze unbroken, defiant even in ruin. That look haunted me more than the gunfire, more than the battlefields. It wasn't vengeance I saw in her eyes, it was truth, the kind that strips a man bare. For the first time since the war began, I understood what it meant to lose everything and still remain human. I had taken that from others. And now, through her silence, she had taken something from me, the last remnants of the lies I had lived by. April 25, 1945. The truth in the enemy's eyes. Later that week, an American officer called me from the group. He was a sergeant, broad-shouldered, with a weathered face that spoke of too many winters in foreign lands. He motioned for me to step forward, and I obeyed. Standing stiffly out of habit, he studied me for a while before speaking. His voice was calm, steady, not cruel, but heavy with meaning. "Do you believe in God?" he asked. The question struck me harder than any interrogation code. For years, the Reich had replaced faith with ideology. We had been gods unto ourselves, worshipping banners and commands. I hesitated, my mouth dry. I didn't know what to answer. He nodded, as if my silence was enough. Then he said, "Then it's time you meet him, before he learns what you've done." The words landed like a sentence, but not a threat. There was no hatred in his tone, only weary conviction. It was as though he was speaking for every soul that had suffered, every life lost on both sides. I looked into his eyes and saw no triumph there. Only sorrow, the kind that comes from understanding too much. I wanted to argue, to explain, to justify, but the truth stopped me. What could I say? That I was following orders. That I didn't know, that I wasn't like the others. Each excuse turned to ash before it reached my tongue. He turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, trembling in the quiet. Around me, the camp went on, guards pacing, prisoners muttering, but his words had carved something deep into me. It was the first time anyone had spoken to me not as a soldier, not as a criminal, but as a man standing at the edge of his own soul. And for the first time, I wondered if meeting God would be the punishment, or the mercy. April 26, 1945. Nuremberg on the horizon. Rumors began to spread through the camp like the wind. The trials are coming. The Americans had started gathering names, generals, officers, commanders, Nuremberg. The word alone carried a weight none of us could ignore. It was whispered in every corner of the enclosure, as if speaking it too loudly would summon judgment itself. At first, I thought it was only another story to keep us obedient. But then I saw the officers, real American intelligence men, walking between the lines, taking notes, marking names on their lists. Every few hours, a truck would arrive, and a handful of prisoners would be taken away. No one ever came back. That night, I sat against the fence, watching the headlights fade down the muddy road. The thought of a courtroom both terrifying and comforted me. To face judgment meant to still exist. To answer for my actions was, in some way, a privilege the dead had been denied. But deep inside, I knew that nothing a court could declare would match the weight already pressing on my soul. The men around me speculated endlessly. Who would hang? Who might walk free? Some still spoke of honor, of sacrifice, of misunderstood loyalty. I said nothing. The time for excuses had died long before we raised our hands in surrender. I thought of my superiors, men who had filled entire rooms with speeches about destiny and purity. now reduced to fugitives hiding among ruins. And I wondered if they, too, felt the same sickening realization I did, that the 1,000-year empire had lasted barely 12, and every stone of it was built from the bones of the innocent. When I closed my eyes, I saw flashes, the signatures, the reports, the marches. Each image now looked absurd, almost theatrical, yet drenched in real blood. I could no longer separate the memory of orders from the sound of suffering that had followed them. As the sun set, the sky turned the same red as the flag that once burned above our barracks. The guards called for lights out, and the camp fell silent. Somewhere beyond the horizon, a new Germany would soon be judged before the world. And I, one of its obedient sons, would have to face the echo of everything I had defended. For the first time, I wished not to survive. April 27, 1945. The photographs. The next morning, the Americans brought a group of us to a tent. Inside, an officer waited with a stack of photographs spread across a wooden table. I didn't understand why I had been chosen until I saw what lay before me. Buchenwald. At first, I looked away. But the officer, a man with sharp eyes and a voice like steel, grabbed one of the photographs and thrust it toward me. "Look," he said. His tone wasn't cruel, only resolute. "You call this victory?" I forced myself to see. Piles of bodies stacked like firewood, faces frozen in horror, eyes staring into nothing. Skeletons wrapped in rags, a child's hand resting on an arm that was no longer attached to a body. The images were black and white, but I could see the colors in my mind. Gray skin, yellow bones, the red of wounds that never healed. I had told myself for years that I hadn't seen the camps, that I wasn't part of it. But that lie shattered with every photograph he laid down. I had seen enough. Even then, I had smelled the smoke. I had read the report stamped with my own signature. The officer said nothing more. He just stood there, waiting. I felt my stomach twist until I thought I might be sick. The paper shook in my hands, the weight of those images heavier than any weapon I had ever held. I wanted to say I didn't know, that I had been misled. But those excuses sounded obscene, even in my mind, so I said nothing. I placed the photo back on the table, my fingers trembling. The officer watched me for a moment, then gathered the photographs and turned away. As I was led back to the wire enclosure, I couldn't breathe properly. The images had burned themselves into my eyelids, and every time I blinked, I saw them again. That night, I understood what true defeat looked like. It wasn't loss of land, or power, or freedom. It was the knowledge of what we had done in the name of those things. The Americans didn't need to punish us. The photographs had already done it. April 28, 1945. The dead do not forget. The nights grew colder, and the camp grew quieter. Many of the men no longer spoke at all. They sat in silence, eyes empty, as if waiting for their ghosts to arrive. For me, they already had. Every night, when the guards' footsteps faded, I saw them, the faces of the ones I had condemned without thought. The prisoners at Dachau, the villagers shot in retribution, the boy who had begged for his father's life before my men dragged him away. I had buried their memories beneath orders and oaths. Now they returned, one by one, their eyes wide open in the darkness. No dream was ever peaceful. Sometimes I heard them screaming. Sometimes, worse, they said nothing at all, just stood there, watching me. I would wake in a cold sweat, gasping, the sound of the gunfire still ringing in my head. During the day, I tried to keep busy, cleaning my cup, folding my torn coat, anything to distract my hands from trembling. But the silence always returned, heavy and patient. The men who still believed in the right clung to their denial like a shield. The rest of us were naked beneath the truth. I often thought of the medic, the one who had said, "Because he's human." I began to understand what he meant. The dead were not haunting me out of vengeance. They were haunting me because I had forgotten they were human. Because in doing so, I had forgotten what it meant to be human myself. The wind howled through the camp that night, and the barbed wire hummed with it. I looked up at the stars, cold and distant above the black horizon, and realized the simplest, most unbearable truth of all: the war would never end. Not for me, not for any of us who remembered. The dead do not forget, and neither, it seemed, could the living. April 29, 1945. The unsent letter. A scrap of paper found its way to me, part of a ration box, flattened and dry. I kept it hidden under my coat until nightfall, when the cap had gone quiet. Then, using a piece of charcoal from the fire pit, I began to write. To my wife, I started, though I hesitated before the second word. What could I possibly say to her? That I was alive, that I missed her, that I had become something she would not recognize. I wrote anyway. I told her I was being held by the Americans, that I was treated fairly, that the war was ending. But then, without meaning to, my hand began to move faster, my thoughts spilling out like blood from an open wound. I told her about Dachau, about the bush shop beside me, about the faces that came to me in the dark. I told her I no longer knew who I was, the man she once loved or the thing the Reich had turned me into. I stopped when I realized my hand was shaking. The charcoal snapped in my grip. I stared at the paper, black words bleeding across the torn surface, and I knew I couldn't send it. The letter wasn't meant for her. It was my confession, and it was too late for forgiveness. When morning came, I folded the paper once, then again, and slipped it into the dirt beneath my sleeping mat. Let it rot there, I thought. Let it be buried with me if I never leave this place. The guard passed by, his shadow moving over the fence line. The others stirred awake, coughing, murmuring, waiting for the same tasteless bread and bitter water. No one spoke of home anymore. The word home had lost its meaning, just another place filled with ghosts. I stared at the rising sun, wondering if she still lived in the same house, if the walls still smelled of lilacs in spring. Maybe she believed I was dead. Maybe she prayed I was. The letter stayed buried. Some truths, I decided, had no right to travel any further than the hands that wrote them. April 30th, 1945. The arrival of the reporters. The day the journalists came, the camp turned into a stage. American officers lined us up in rows while men with cameras and notebooks walked among us, recording every detail, our faces, our uniforms, our silence. The flash of the cameras burned white in the gray morning. I watched them move, their expressions unreadable, professional, almost cold. They didn't gloat, they didn't insult, they observed. Each photograph was a document of shame, a piece of evidence for a world that would soon want to understand how civilization had turned to madness. Some of the prisoners lowered their heads. Others tried to stand taller, as if dignity could still be salvaged. I didn't move, my face was numb, my body hollow. I wondered what story it would tell when these images reached the papers back home. Would they see us as monsters, or just as men stripped of everything, left to face the wreckage of what we'd done? One journalist stopped before me, a young woman with a press badge pinned to her jacket. Her shoes were caked in mud, her notepad damp from the rain. She studied me for a moment. Pen post, name, she asked. I hesitated, then spoke it aloud for the first time since my capture. Hearing it felt strange, as though it belonged to someone else. She wrote it down carefully, her face giving nothing away. Then she lowered her pen. You were SS, I nodded. Her eyes lingered on me, not with hatred, but with the same steady gaze the doctor had shown my wounded comrade days before. She didn't ask more, she simply said, "The world will see now," and moved on. When they left, the camp was quiet again. The only proof of their visit was the lingering smell of smoke from their jeeps and the distant echo of shutters clicking. I thought of how they had looked at us, not as soldiers, not as victims, but as witnesses to our own crimes. Their cameras didn't accuse, they revealed. And that, I realized, was the difference between vengeance and truth. That night, I lay awake staring at the dark sky and wondered how many faces, how many lads, would stare back from the pages of those photographs. May 1st, 1945. The conversation with the chaplain. The chaplain came to the camp the next day. His uniform was different, cleaner, softer, with a small cross stitched onto the chest. He carried no weapon, only a Bible and a pack of cigarettes. He moved quietly among the prisoners, offering cigarettes and brief words to any who would listen. Most turned away. When he reached me, he simply held out a cigarette. I accepted it, unsure why. For a while, we smoked in silence. The smoke drifted up through the wire, vanishing into the blue. Then he spoke, his voice low and steady. "Do you believe in forgiveness?" The question hung in the air like the echo of a bell. I stared at the ground, at the cigarette trembling between my fingers. "Not for men like me," I said. He nodded slowly. Maybe not from others, he said, but perhaps from God. I almost laughed. Not in mockery, but in despair. God. I whispered. If he saw what we did, he turned his face away long ago. The chaplain's eyes didn't waver. Maybe, he said. Or maybe he sent me here so you'd finally look for him. We sat there for a long time, neither speaking. The smoke burned low between us, curling into the cold air. I wanted to tell him everything, every name, every order, every moment I could never erase. But the words stayed trapped in my throat. Before leaving, he placed a hand on my shoulder. The difference between us and you, he said gently, is that we still try to forgive. He walked away, his coat flapping softly in the wind. I watched him disappear past the guard post, a small, solitary figure in a world still scarred by hate. And then, for the first time since the war began, I felt my chest tighten, not from fear or guilt, but from something I hadn't felt in years. I didn't know if it was sorrow or hope. Maybe it was both. That night, I wept quietly, the cigarette long gone cold between my fingers. May 3, 1945. The liberation. The morning came without warning. No shouting, no trucks, no orders. Only a stillness that felt different from all the others before it. The guards moved slower that day, speaking in hushed tones among themselves. A few even smiled faintly, as though they knew something we didn't. I watched them from my corner near the fence, a strange unease stirring inside me. Then, around midday, an officer climbed onto a crate and called for attention. His voice was clear, steady, almost gentle. "You are free," he said. "Just that. No ceremony, no condition. Those of you not wanted for questioning are to be released. You may go." For a moment, no one moved. The words seemed too impossible to grasp. After months of surrender, of punishment, of waiting for judgment, freedom sounded like a foreign language. A few men laughed, short, nervous bursts that turned into coughs. Others stood rigid, unsure whether to believe it. The gates were opened, and the wire that had caged us no longer mattered. Some ran immediately, disappearing into the distance without a backward glance. Others, like me, stayed still, watching the horizon as if waiting for orders that would never come. When I actually stepped beyond the fence, my boots sank into the wet grass. The air outside felt heavier, not lighter. Freedom, I realized, didn't erase what came before it. It only exposed it. The road ahead stretched through fields of blackened soil and broken homes, leading toward a world that no longer had a place for men like me. The Americans watched quietly as we left. Their faces held no triumph. They looked tired, hollow, and somehow older than the war itself. I passed the medic again, the same one who had treated my wounded soldier weeks before. He met my gaze for a brief moment, then nodded once. I returned the gesture, though I wasn't sure why. It felt like the smallest acknowledgement between two survivors of something far greater than both of us. As I walked, I glanced back at the camp. The fences, the huts, the watchtowers, all still standing, yet already fading into the distance. I thought of the men who would remain behind, the ones whose names were written down, who would soon face trials, sentences, maybe the rope. I didn't know why I had been spared, perhaps because my crimes were smaller, quieter, the kind that left no witnesses, only ghosts. The wind carried the faint sound of church bells from somewhere beyond the hills. I followed the road without purpose, my steps slow and heavy. Every village I passed was a ruin, every face that looked at me a reminder of what we had done. No one offered food. No one offered forgiveness. Freedom, I discovered, was not peace, it was a mirror, one that forced me to see myself without the shield of uniform or ideology. And in that reflection, I saw what I truly was, not a soldier, not a victim, but a man who had finally outlived his own beliefs. The war was over, but for me, it was only beginning. May 5, 1945, the ruins of Berlin. When I reached Berlin, I almost didn't recognize it. The city that once pulsed with banners, parades, and marching boots now lay still, a carcass of brick and smoke. The air was thick with ash and the bitter tang of burned fuel. Buildings stood like broken teeth against a colorless sky, their windows hollow, their walls bleeding soot. I walked down Wilhelmstrasse, where I had once saluted superiors and believed in glory. Now, The only sound was the crunch of glass beneath my boots and the distant creak of twisted metal. Somewhere, an old piano played, not by human hands, but by the wind brushing its exposed strings through a collapsed wall. Each note sounded like a ghost remembering how to mourn. Children wandered among the ruins, barefoot and thin, their faces pale with dust. They didn't look at me. To them, I was just another shadow moving through a dead city. A girl, maybe 10, dragged a wooden cart filled with scrap. She paused when she saw the black remnants of my uniform. For a moment, her eyes hardened, then she turned away and kept walking. I wanted to speak, to tell her I wasn't one of them anymore, but who was I fooling? The uniform still clung to me like a curse. The closer I came to the government quarter, the worse it became. The great ministries were hollowed shells, their columns blackened, their flags gone. The Reich Chancellery, once the center of power, had collapsed into itself, a crater of shattered marble and twisted rebar. Near what was once the Führer's bunker, the air still smelled faintly of burned oil and something else, something darker. People whispered that he was dead. I didn't care. For me, he had been dead the moment he asked us to stop thinking. I climbed what remained of a balcony overlooking the Tiergarten. From there, I could see the whole city, smoke rising from the east, Soviet banners fluttering among the ruins, tanks crawling like insects through the rubble. Berlin had fallen, not to an army, but to the truth. Every wall screamed the same message. This is what obedience builds. I found a bench, its iron frame bent but still standing. I sat there, hands shaking, staring at the cracked pavement. Once, I had imagined that victory would bring me pride. Now, defeat brought only clarity. The Reich hadn't just destroyed nations. It had devoured the souls of its own people. A group of children passed again, laughing faintly as they chased a ball made of rags. The sound startled me. Laughter. In this graveyard of a city. It wasn't joy but defiance. Somehow, they were still alive. As the sun set behind the ruins, I realized I was seeing something the Reich had tried to erase. Life continuing despite the wreckage. Not for glory, not for ideology, just for the simple, stubborn will to exist. And for the first time, I wondered if redemption didn't come through forgiveness, but through watching the world rise again, after we had done everything to destroy it. May 8, 1945. The Confession. I write these words from a small room in what remains of a farmhouse on the outskirts of Hanover. The war has officially ended. The radio spoke of surrender, of peace, of a new beginning for Germany. But for me, there is no peace, only memory. The walls here are quiet, but inside my mind the gunfire never stopped. The Americans have moved on, leaving behind a broken land and men like me to face ourselves. I found paper and ink in a drawer and decided to write, not to justify, not to be forgiven, but to remember. If these pages survive me, let them serve as testimony that once there was a man who believed in something monstrous, and only through defeat did he learn what it meant to be human. I think often of the medic, of the chaplain, of the woman in the village who looked at me with eyes full of truth. They were my judges long before any tribunal. Their faces follow me, not with hatred, but with the silent question I cannot answer. Why? I burn nothing now, I hide nothing. My insignia, my past, my silence, all of it lies open before me. I surrendered to save my life, but it was only in being conquered that I understood its worth. The Americans taught me humanity not with kindness, but with honesty. They showed me that mercy is not weakness, and that truth is its own punishment. Outside, spring has begun to touch the ruins. I hear birds again, timid, uncertain, as if testing the air after so many years of smoke. Perhaps that is what redemption is, not forgiveness, but the quiet courage to live among the ruins and never look away.